Testing. Okay, good. Well, I know it's working out there. I just need to make sure it's working here. Um, huh? Well, because I didn't have my mic on. I'd turn it on. No, last Wednesday we didn't have sound because I keep forgetting sometimes that you have to every once in a while make sure that the mic feed is picking up the input plug, and so it is apparently. So we'll go and get started. Then Hattie, you're not here. No, still going. Um, well, I mean, I can still hear it. I can hear the speakers. I was just talking more quietly. Um, but anyway, let's go and have a word of prayer, and we'll get started. Holy Father in heaven, we thank you for our day, for the blessings of life you've given us, for the word you've preserved for us, and our opportunity to study it together. Help us to glorify you in all that we do. Help us to seek your truth, and help us to find the pattern of worship and work in this local church, that we might always glorify you and do your will while we're here. We pray this in your son's name. So we're continuing some discussions that we were having uh, last week, and now I got to get this properly. Um, we were talking about this pattern of the first century church in terms of its authority, and we're getting into some areas, by the way, that we're going to talk about in more detail later on in the chapters. But we were talking about the limits on an eldership authority, and we started talking about how that impacted the collective action of the church. And if you remember, we talked about essentially three aspects of work that the church is tasked to perform. And whether we're institutional or non-institutional, there seems to be an agreement on that. And we basically say there's three things that we need to be involved in. What do we need to be involved in as the Lord's church? Preaching, evangelism, benevolence, okay, exhorting, encouraging, that'd be part of it. So exhortation, encouragement, benevolence, and evangelism. Now, that's pretty broad, pretty broad categories, of course. And the biggest problem we get is when we start defining what actually those are, and what the scope of those things are, and how they need to be performed. And that's really kind of what we're talking about here. We were talking about some of Brother Ramsey's comments here, where he starts talking about the organization of the church under the eldership and what their rights are and what their roles are in terms of leading. And if you remember, one of the main points that he makes is that the eldership is empowered to govern over all three of these acts that the church is doing. And we made this point that when we look at evangelism, which is where he starts, is it fair to say that there is a distinction between what I do individually in in evangelism and what the church does collectively? Yes, I think it is. If I decide to go out and talk to my neighbor about the gospel, and I sit down and have a Bible study with him, that's not the church doing it. That's me doing it individually. Whereas, if the church has a gospel meeting and we invite a preacher in and we collectively go out and say, all right, we're going to go out and invite our neighbors and we're going to do all these things. We're kind of merging the two, right? Because we're asking you to do things individually, but we're doing them kind of with the same mind and with the same purpose. So there's an element of both of those in mind. But the point there being that there is a distinction that we can very easily see between what the church does and what the individual does. And from an eldership standpoint, would we agree that the eldership has the right to say that this is how the church is going to work collectively in evangelism? But I can't go to you and say, why haven't you had a study with your neighbor yet? I need you to go over and do this. This week you need to have 5 Bible studies lined up. And if not, you need to be able to explain to me why you didn't. Would we say that's an overstep of an elder's position? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, there's a big distinction there. That's a great point, and that's a great point. In fact, if let's look real quick. There's a passage I was going to talk about earlier, but since you brought that up, let's look at in First Peter, um, First Peter 3, isn't it? See, this is what happens when I jump ahead of my notes. I always forget where it is. It's the passage where no, it's not your fault. Um, where it talks about he speaks as an elder to shepherd the flock that is among you. Not that's not shepherd the flock is among you, but oh yeah, chapter 5. In First Peter 5, verse 1, where it says, "So I exhort the elders among you as fellow elders and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock." Going to what Laura said, notice the idea is the shepherd's job to go out and basically say, all right, I'm going to dictate how you're going to live your life, and I'm going to tell and I'm going to be an overseer over everything that you do, Larry. Yeah. Yeah, and that's an example of domineering and lording it over. That's the idea of feeling like I need to be very much in control. And that's the whole idea of the Boston movement that took place in Churches of Christ years and years ago. The idea that the eldership can basically task you with how much you're going to give, and I want a list of all your friends and your neighbors, and you need to be doing this, and basically dictating how you're going to go about doing these things. And so there was some language that he used in here that made it pretty clear that he's saying, look, in fact, it's over, yeah, in verse page 79, where he says that elders are responsible to see that the congregation obeys the command to preach the gospel of Christ to all the nations in the world. And I have several issues with that, but the main one there is that idea of what exactly does that look like? And to what extent does the eldership have a control over that? And I suspect that the author would agree with everything we've said here. That look, we're not saying the eldership has the right to go tell you how to evangelize, but it certainly has the right to tell the church how to evangelize. It even has the right to tell the church what to evangelize. We're not going to preach this because this is not scriptural. We're not going to allow this to be taught in our worship. So I suspect he would very clearly agree that there is a distinction between what the church does in evangelism and what the individual does in evangelism. Yeah, and I don't think anybody has a problem with that. But then we get to benevolence. And all of a sudden, the distinctions all go out the window. There's no, maybe you've heard this, what the individual can do, the collective can do. There's no, how can you say that an individual Christian can be involved in this, but the collective cannot be involved in this? Well, as we've already said, if we can make the argument and show pretty clearly that there is a sense in which the eldership's oversight is different over the individual than it is over the collective, that indicates that the work being done is also going to be different. Does that make sense? I don't think that's a strong leap in terms of what we're talking about. And so when we think about this, let's see, where do I want to go here? Actually skipped over a bunch of stuff, but that's probably okay. Larry, go ahead. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Right. It's First Timothy 5. Yeah. No. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think you can. That passage you're quoting in it, 1 Timothy 5:16. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. There's a principle, by the way, that I want to carry over into this idea of benevolence. And the point that he's making is that, and let's be now, what widows are in under discussion? Are these Christian widows or non-Christian widows? I think that I think the context is pretty clear that even the widow that is considered to be not worthy of support is a widow that is among their ranks. And if you remember, if you go back, how he describes this person and how they're supposed to be viewed, he goes up in verse 9 and where he talks about all the characteristics and qualities of this person. We're not going just to assist a widow just because she happens to be a Christian. Even there's even more qualifications that are going to be placed. He says, not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, having a reputation for good works, if she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, has devoted herself to every good work. In other words, this is not just, I wouldn't say not just a Christian. That should describe any Christian woman, shouldn't it? Or should describe a Christian man. But the idea being that here is someone who is living the life. They have done what they are called to do. We have fellowship with them in the working of the gospel, in the work of the saints, all the things that we've talked about. She's engaged in doing what she needs to do. And there's a principle. In fact, I think we'll mention it later on. I think it's in Galatians 6, in fact, that let the one who has been taught the gospel share all good things with the one who has taught him. There's a spiritual relationship where if I have helped you spiritually, you want to help me physically. If I have needs, you're going to respond to that, right? There's a fellowship that's involved there. And the idea there is that if someone is in our midst that's not engaged in fellowship spiritually on a spiritual level, there's no reciprocity that's required there. But even on a greater point, the widow who's not a widow indeed, who has family who can take care of her, we compare that to the woman or the widow who has no family, who has no options. The principle there seems to be, is there a way in which her needs can be met by someone who is more able to meet those needs, and B, has a more direct responsibility to fulfill those needs. And if that's the case, that's where it needs to go. The first priority is not for the church to do the work. The first priority is for the work to be done by the one who is assigned the task of doing the work. If that makes sense. David, go ahead. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. And let me put this out to you. I'm getting ahead of myself because we're getting into benevolence now. But since we're on this discussion of widows, let me ask this question. Let's say that this woman has family that ought to be taking care of her, but is not, but has refused to do so. Yeah, that's another question. Yeah, 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 yeah. Larry. Yeah, yeah. I think the implication here is that the family is also in the body. That they are part of the body. They have widows. They can take care of us. Okay, the church is not going to take on your responsibility. You need to do that. Now, if they refuse, first of all, if they refuse and they're in the body, what's the church's response if a family is not fulfilling their obligation to care for their mother-in-law? Yeah, there needs to be discipline there. That's someone who is not walking, that is walking disorderly. But again, and on the other hand, if that person is not in the body, the church has no influence over what they're going to do. But now, does that person really have people who are her family anymore? Well, not really, because her spiritual family is her family. Her physical family, as Larry's pointed in that situation, has turned their back on. And so the point of this is not so much a checklist to say, all right, this widow checks this box, this box, this box, this box, and if not, well, sorry, she's out of luck. It's to make sure we understand. I think his point is, what is our priority? What is the church's priority as opposed to the individual responsibility? And I think in a lot of ways that makes Larry's point even more pointed here, because the whole point of Paul bringing this up is to tell us that there's things that you need to be doing as an individual, and you can't have the church do the work for you. You got to go take care of that. And if you're not willing to do it, you're in dereliction of what you're supposed to be doing. So I think that is an important concept whenever we start talking about this question of individual and collective. Any comments or questions? Or, yeah, 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 yeah. I think, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as we get into Galatians and James, is that the point of of the eldership in a lot of ways in benevolence is, at the end of the day, the only reason the church should be involved is if the individual is unable to meet the need. Now, I'm not saying that they can't be involved. I'm simply saying that that's really the purpose of this. That's the whole point of us being together. We can do things collectively that we can't do individually, but that doesn't mean that we can just take the individual responsibilities and push them off onto the church so that we no longer have to do that. And that's an important point for us. And I think it comes into play, especially when we start talking about this question of benevolence. Um, let's see, where so all of a sudden, if you notice, here's what I want to read this, and hopefully you picked up some things that I picked up on. It's on page 80, where he's been talking about elders' authority in the gospel. He's now saying elders' authority in church benevolence, and he says elders are responsible to see to it that the congregation fulfills its benevolent obligations in practicing pure religion and doing good to all men, beginning with the saints. Now, let's stop there for a second. All right, let's the same conversation that we had earlier. Does the eldership have the responsibility to tell me, or the right to tell me, how I'm spending my money? Does the church eldership have the right to tell me you are not spending enough on individual benevolence? No, yeah, that's something you ought to do. Now, yeah, yeah, you can't compel somebody to do good. It has to be done, to oh, as far as going, you made a point about this in the last section. Now I can't remember. I've lost my train of thought, but the same application is here. I can't compel that individual to do this. All I can do, this is her point. The eldership might say, look, you're doing really well, uh, but I don't feel like, like we had a sister has need. This is not something necessarily the church needs to be tasked with. Is this something you could do? Here's an opportunity for you to do good here, and I know you got the means to take care of it. That's shepherding. That's the idea of directing. Now, can that person say, "I just don't think I can do it," and the elder says, "Well, then you're disfellowship because you have to do what we said." No, that's not how it works, and it goes back to your point. Compelling somebody to do good is is it just doesn't help. It doesn't. It's about fixing a need, but it isn't about helping this person. They've got to be willing to do this because that's what they want to do. So again, we see there's that collective or individual distinction already from the very beginning. And again, I would suspect that the writer of this article would acknowledge that. Yeah, the eldership can only govern in terms of the collective action, but what you do with your own money, that's going to be your choice. All right. Well, let's bear that in mind when we keep talking about this, because he goes on and he says the following scripture asserts this obligation though others could be added. And he goes to James 1:27. His pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Now, he says in this scripture, James makes use of the, quote, representative individual, unquote, to teach the responsibility of benevolent action by the collective body and to teach the responsibility of the collective body in keeping itself unspotted from the world. Now, has anyone ever heard that? I've never heard that argument before. The collective individual. I'm sure it's made. The collective individual. The idea, or the representative, I'm sorry, the representative individual. The idea that, yeah, James is talking about the individual, but he's really talking about the church. And therefore, anything that we read in James that's talking about the individual, or at least James 1:27, he's really talking about the church. Would we argue, first of all, doesn't there have to be some sort of indication in the passage that would dictate that? That seems like a big stretch to say right off the bat. This individual statement is clearly talking about the representative individual, meaning the church. Where would we get that from? I don't. That seems like a pretty big leap to me. Yeah, you've got to make it up. You have to interject it because it's not there. And we start thinking about this, and we go to James 1. And let's look at some of the things that are said in this passage, because again, it kind of feels like this is a selective application. I'm going to apply the representative individual to James 1, and I'm not sure how I do it in any of these other things. Notice how many times the language that is used in James 1 is individual in nature. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. Now, can the church ask for wisdom? Yes. Is that his point? No. He's talking about an individual here. It will be given. Let him ask in faith. Again, he goes on and talks. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, the rich in his humiliation. Again, he's talking about individual applications that need to be made. The blessed is the man in verse 12 who remains steadfast under trial. He's talking about an individual's responsibility. Now, should the church be steadfast under trial? Yes. But what's he talking? That's not his point, though. He's talking about how an individual is going to stand up. And then in verse 13, I think this really hits home. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. Is there a representative individual being involved here? No, he's clearly talking about an individual. That's his point. And I don't even know that there is necessarily a representative individual there that's being discussed. Each person, he says, is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. So he's been talking about individual things over and over again, and it keeps going on down in verse 22. Be doers of the word and not hearers only. He keeps going on. Verse 25, the one who looks into the perfect law and perseveres, being not a hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his deed. Is this talking about collective action? Clearly, he's talking about the fact that you as an individual need to be living according to God's will, and you need to be honest about how you're living your life. And it's in that context that he says in verse 26, if anyone thinks he's religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. All right. Again, is there a representative individual here? You'd have to work pretty hard to see that. And you'd have to, I think, what does it mean for the church collectively to bridle its tongue? I'm not even sure how that would work. He's clearly talking about individuals, but all of a sudden in verse 27, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and keep oneself unstained from the world. What's the contrast being made here? He's contrasting this man who claims he's religious, but this is how he lives. And now he says, no, this is what it looks like to be religious. Now, if I'm talking about the individual over here, why wouldn't I be talking about the individual over here? It, this is an odd argument that he makes, and it, as David put it, it feels like something you just make up because I want to apply this to the church. And so I'm just going to make up this idea of the representative individual. I have no idea. I have no doubt that there are passages that you could probably make this argument, but you would make that argument because the context demands that you make it. For example, is Ephesians 5, is that an example of would you say that Ephesians 5, when it talks about the husband and wife, is there a representative individual being talked about there? What is the husband-wife relationship supposed to represent? Christ in the church. The husband and the wife are very clearly representing a representative individual because the context tells us that they are. But there's no indication in James that that's what's going on. But he makes this idea that it's representing to teaching the responsibilities of benevolent actions by the collective church. And he goes on and he goes to Galatians 6. So let's look at Galatians 6, because this is one probably that if you were going to make an argument for this, I think this is certainly a much better place to go than James 1:20, 1:28 or 1:27. But he goes to Galatians 6:10, which tells us so then as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. Now, when we read that, I mean, that's probably pretty clear, right? Let us do good to all, especially those of the household of faith. What's our takeaway out of that? Who are we to do good to? Well, Christians first, and then all. Yeah. In other words, the idea that one takes priority to the other. Let's do good to all, everybody, especially the subset of that, those who belong to the household of faith. Larry, go ahead. Mhm. Yeah. And there's no, again, it's very clearly talking about that. And I wanted to go look at some of this passage and look at the context of this. He says in verse 1, brethren, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Now, is there a sense in which that's a collective action? I think so. I mean, there's a sense in which it is. Certainly, I mean, eh, but there's also a sense in which the individual ought to be doing this. In fact, the individual typically is the one that's going to be in the best position to do that. And we would never look at that and say, see, bearing one another's burdens is a church responsibility first and foremost. No, it's an individual responsibility first and foremost. He goes on, if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Again, it's an individual discussion. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbors. And that's pretty clear. What we're talking about here is you need to understand and do what you need to be doing. And to his point, I think it's pretty clearly saying the church can't do it for you. You've got to be about doing this yourself. For each one, he says, will bear his own load. And then we get into verse 6, and I think it's interesting. I hadn't thought about this before, but I think you can make an argument that verse 6 brings a very different spin on what we read in verse 10. It starts in verse 6. Let the one who is taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. First, what's he described there? We alluded to this earlier. What's he talking about there? Share all good things with the one who teaches. Who's the one who teaches? Sorry? An individual. the teacher, probably the evangelist, but doesn't have to be. I think in this context, it seems most likely that this is someone, whether it's the elder or the evangelist who's doing the work of teaching. And the idea that let the one who is taught share all good things. There's a relationship that is based on the sharing of the gospel. And we see this when we look at some of the other examples of benevolence in the New Testament. That same relationship is used. He says, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows in the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. Now, how are we going to be, who's being judged here? To your point earlier, it's the one who makes that decision. How are you sharing with this person? How are you deciding to use your funds and use your resources? And notice, by the way, that all this idea of sowing and reaping is said in the context of the gospel. And so he says, so then, in other words, except not yet. Verse 9, and let us not grow weary of doing good. Well, what kind of doing good have we already been talking about? Sharing the gospel? What's from the very beginning of the chapter? What's also discussed? Bearing one another's burdens. And the biggest burden of all of that in this passage is what? Huh? Well, fulfilling the law. Okay. What does he say in verse 1? Yeah. If anyone's caught in a transgression, ye who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Is that doing good? That's a good work, isn't it? Everything we've talked about in chapter 6 has to do with spiritual things, has to do with sharing in a spiritual nature and doing things that are spiritually good for one another. And so when he says in verse 9, let's not grow weary of doing good. Now, I don't think that means he's not talking about physical benevolence. But is that really the main point that he's making here? Everything we talked about so far in terms of doing good has been about making sure that all of us are remaining faithful to God and that the gospel is being taught and we are being built up as one body. And so when we get to this point of let's not grow weary in doing good, in other words, don't stop bearing one another's burdens. Don't stop restoring the one who is struggling spiritually. Don't stop taking care of each other and encouraging each other in the teaching of the gospel. And so he says, so then in verse 10, in other words, because of all this that we have said, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. Yeah, I wonder, I don't know that this excludes doing good in terms of, feeding somebody or helping somebody in a physical way or, helping somebody with a loan payment or something like that. But it sure seems to me that the main thrust of this is about doing spiritual good. I mean, am I wrong on that? Would you agree? Am I reaching? All right, go ahead. Yeah, 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 yeah. And so that I think that's the idea that you need to be doing, wherever you go, you need to be doing good. And I think the primary thing is spiritual, but to your point, I don't think that excludes the idea that if somebody has a physical need out in the world that I'm not going to help them. But our first priority is always going to be the household of faith. Why? Because we have that bond. We have that spiritual reciprocity that we have with one another. That is always going to be our primary focus. Mhm. Yeah, 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 yeah. Mhm. It is. I actually saw somebody, which was, oh, the immigration debate has brought up some really weird ideas by people. And one of which is this idea that somehow it is not noble to prioritize your own family over the needs of someone else. People were making the argument. Look, our first priority My first priority is my family. Our first priority is our nation. And somebody will come at you. You would really say that you're going to prefer this group over that group. That if this person has a need and this person has a need, you're going to side with this person just because you have some sort of a relationship. This is one of the most odd things I've ever heard. But we all know that. I suspect that people are being dishonest when they say that. Yeah, 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 yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I got to make sure that you're going to be okay over here. You be all right for a day. If I go take care of this, all right, I'll go do that. And yeah, I think that's a great point there. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not, I was going to say, I'm not always sure that that's the most sincere argument. I think it's made for the purpose of making a point. But ultimately, I think we always see that there is going to be this preference. And I think we also see here pretty clearly again, there's no necessity for a quote unquote representative individual in this passage. It's not there. So I didn't get as far as I wanted to go, but we're going to look at some things in this passage. And let's see. Yeah, as we get into that, we're going to talk. We're going to start talking about specific examples of cooperation and what that looks like. And we'll finish up kind of in Brother Ramsey's article, and also look at some of the things that Kyle Pope brings out in his, and we'll go from there. So thank you all for your attention, and we'll stop there.